2025, Ukraine has been facing unprecedented pressure from one of its key partners, the United States. The Trump administration has chosen not to act as Ukraine's ally, but rather as a mediator between Ukraine and Europe on the one hand and Russia on the other. This shift has fundamentally changed the geopolitical framework of Russia's war against Ukraine. Around the world, the language of victory has largely been replaced by the language of peace. Yet, under current conditions, peace often implies that Ukraine will not regain its occupied territories, and such a peace may in fact amount to Ukraine's defeat. In this episode, we explain why this is a dangerous path. We also look back at 2025 and summarize its key developments. You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. Explain Ukraine is a podcast by UkraineWorld, an English-language media platform about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today is Tatiana Oharkova, a Ukrainian journalist and public intellectual, the head of the international department at the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and author of the podcast L'Ukraine face à la guerre, Ukraine Facing the War in French. Explaining Ukraine is produced by UkraineWorld. Before we begin, a quick reminder, you can support our work on Patreon. Your contributions are essential. We rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal. You'll find all the relevant links in the episode description. So let's begin. So, Tanya, let's talk about 2025, the year that is approaching its end. And we will talk about, of course, the attempts to set up a kind of a peace negotiations to achieve peace. But at the same time, let us talk about the major developments on 2025. I think we will start with this peace deal. And my impression is that the major revolution of the 2025 is that the United States of America ceased to be a Ukrainian ally, an ally of Ukraine. It turned into a kind of a mediator between Russia and Ukraine, and therefore in this mediating role, it actually tries to appease Russia much more than to impose justice or some ideas of just peace. And therefore, the situation of Ukraine, of course, became much more difficult globally. Would you agree?
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. And I would also add that United States has never been Ukraine's ally in this war. They used to be our partner as European partners because they were never in war with Russia, starting from 2014 and then 2022. But I would agree that this year has dramatically changed the general American approach to the war and to what is going on between geopolitically, because this new Trump administration is doing things previous administrations, Biden's administrations, would never do. Like they stopped any kind of military aid to Ukraine, and almost any kind. There are something arriving, but they're small sums. What they really do, they sell American weapons through many mechanisms to Europeans. So all American weapons which arrive to Ukraine today, they are bought by European partners for Ukraine from Americans. So this is dramatic change, and it copes with what Trump promised to his electoral base, to people who voted for him, that United States will not pay for this war. And what is precisely he's boasting now, saying that United States are not financing this war. But when you talk about mediating this war, I would also add some important things here, because if you try to see United States as a mediator, it would be a position somewhere in between, right? So somewhere in between Russia and Ukraine. We do remember that Donald Trump arrived to power 1 year ago saying that he'll produce kind of peace through strength. I remember this was his formula. And we imagined 1 year ago that this strength would be at least on both Ukraine and Russia. But what we are observing for many months already, I mean, these meeting with Putin in Alaska and etc., we see and we witness a lot of pressure on Ukraine, but almost no pressure on Russia. So let's be serious. What kind of pressure had Trump administration produced on Russia? We can talk about sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft, and these are the only mechanisms introduced since many months already. At the same time, starting from February 2025, there were numerous episodes when Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Ukraine in general were threatened by that Americans would stop helping Ukraine. They would stop information, intelligence data. They will stop military aid, etc., etc. I would say that if this mediator role is much closer to Russia than to Ukraine.
Yes, and what is also important, I think, is to understand that both Trump and Putin have kind of a similar vision of the world. The vision of the world is like the world should be divided between the spheres of influence, and the international law doesn't matter. We see it not only on the Ukrainian case, but, for example, the Trump politics also with regard to the Middle East and Israel attack on Gaza. But we are talking about many different elements of this peace plan. So there were many different leaks, and there were the plan of 28 points, and then it was reduced, and then, and there are several elements which I think they are the most important. One of the elements is basically the question whether Ukraine will recognize that some of its territories are occupied and forever occupied by Russia, and probably the part of the Russian territory. And I think Ukraine is facing an enormous pressure on this. But there are definitely big challenges, international law, Ukrainian law challenges to do that, even if we set aside the moral question of this. The second big question is the question of security guarantees, whether Ukraine will get big security guarantees from the United States, and if the United States suggests big security guarantees, in which way they are different from NATO membership, right? Because Ukraine wants to join NATO, and Russia says it's out of the question. But if Ukraine gets security guarantees from the United States, in which sense it is different from NATO membership? And I think the third question is tactically what kind of withdrawal, arms withdrawal and military withdrawal we actually plan. If Ukraine is pushed to withdraw its troops, it's obvious that Russians will enter into this demilitarized zone, and we kind of walked through this many times in history. But if what happens if Ukraine withdraws and Russia also withdraws, as Zelenskyy argues, then it's also very utopian, because if we have several cities which are totally demilitarized, the question is who will execute the administrative power there, right?
At the moment we talk, we do know already that Ukraine, that Zelenskyy in Ukraine has fully rejected the plan of this demilitarized zone, because it was clear from the very beginning that for Russians it would mean that maybe their army will not enter these regions. We are talking about Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and some other cities in this conglomeration. But the idea was, so army will not be there, but our Nadzgvardia, so National Guard, will be there, and Russian police will be there. So frankly, it's the same thing. It's like you already conquered the territory, but you don't need army to enter the territory. So they will already occupy these territories with National Guard, with Russian police. You can easily guess they will bring every Russian administration and all the other stuff. So this plan is rejected, and it's still under discussion. So it's still under pressure about how to handle this. But let's also, an important role in all these peace deal negotiations is what Ukrainians think about it. Let's talk about this. So recently there was a Ukrainian poll published, and sociologists asked people, Ukrainians, both displaced people and people who lived in non-occupied territories all across Ukraine. What do you think about this idea about Ukrainians withdrawing from this Donbas region just to make some peace, and maybe Russia will leave us alone? And the figures are very explicit, because 75% of Ukrainians all across Ukraine are against this plan. So they're against the plan to withdraw Ukrainian troops from the territory Russia didn't conquer physically, military, but they want it now. And the question is why? I think that it is clear enough why people think so, because as deeply as every Ukrainian wants peace as soon as possible, we do understand that we have to get something in exchange. I mean, if the objective is a peace, we're talking about peace plan, right? So giving territories to Russia will simply not bring peace to anybody, because we do know that it never happened in the past. It never worked in the past. So there is no reason why now conceding territories where Ukrainians live today will appease Putin, And we know that from 2014 and then from any other period of Ukrainian history. So if this is a false objective, you cannot make it work. You cannot make an effective model of this, because we all know that what Russians have in their constitution, right? This is not only Donetsk and Lugansk regions, right? They also have Zaporizhia and Kherson. And if today, for example, they say, okay, we'll create a frozen front lines in southern regions like Zaporizhia and Kherson, but we want all Donbass. Where are the guarantees that 1 month later, I don't know, maybe 1 week later, they will come back and say, look, we have our constitution, and Ukrainians, they do occupy our territories. So there is no guarantee. So we have to dismantle, because from the legal point of view, there is a clash between two constitutions, between the Ukrainian constitution, which claims that everything which is Ukrainian, which used to be Ukrainian, which is still Ukrainian, including Crimea, is Ukrainian. So you cannot make exceptions like that, because there is no ground for that, and both legal, moral, or whatever, any other ground, just to concede this territory. And that's why all these tricks, they will never function, unfortunately.
Yes, and here we come to this question why Ukraine is demanded concessions like, accepting that certain territories are Russian, meaning the changes into Ukrainian constitution. Why, for example, there is no talk about changing Russian constitution? Because
exactly.
Kherson...
At least about Kherson.
At least about Kherson and Zaporizhia, at least about those territories that Russia has not occupied. But another thing that worries me is that we kind of shifted the discourse from the idea how to regain the occupied territories in general to the idea whether Ukraine should move from those lands that it controls. The idea that was kind of ridiculized still half a year ago, 1 year ago, or 2 years ago, when Ukrainians were saying, Russians declared something in their constitution, and of course we will not remove from that. Now we seriously discuss it, and the people in Washington seriously discuss it, and we see it in the public space, whether there will be unilateral withdrawal or a bilateral withdrawal. First of all, I don't understand how in the reality of this war, of the drone war, we can talk about withdrawal, because, if you withdrew, remember this discussion in 2014, 2015, it was the Minsk agreements, and also withdrawal of the heavy machinery, heavy arms, which meant, for example, artillery or Grad systems or these reactive rocket systems. But now it just doesn't make any sense, because we have the drone warfare, and the drones can go as deep as 40, 50 kilometers into the rear of the enemy from both sides.
Yes, exactly. So when we look what is happening right now, we can see a lot of similarities with what happened back in Minsk agreements, because we were also talking about ceasefire, and once again, any negotiations, maybe step zero would be to create a ceasefire to talk peacefully about something. But the problem is, and I think this is a major achievement of Russian agenda right now, and nobody talks about that Russians imposed, helped by Americans, that we talk seriously about all these sophisticated matters about front lines, about territories, about NATO membership of Ukraine or not membership, security guarantees, about all these abstract things, and not a single minute of a ceasefire from the Russian side. So it looks like, look at Ukrainian newspapers and look at international newspapers talking about Ukraine today. What I've noticed that for weeks already, newspapers talk about these negotiations, about these meetings in Florida, in Geneva, and then in Berlin, and in many other places. So journalists are busy talking about that. And nobody talks about that, not a single minute, not a single day of a ceasefire. So it looks like, if you are not deep into the subject, it looks like, look, Russia and Ukraine and United States, they're talking about potential peace. Like, if you are not in Ukraine, you could have an impression that we are seriously talking about something and that peace could be produced in a couple of weeks or maybe months, or I don't know. But the problem is that all these peace negotiations are taking place where the full, total war is taking place. I mean, total war every day, every night, and not only on the front lines, right? So recently, Odessa region were severely hit by Russian rockets, missiles, and whatever, drones, no electricity, no heating, no water. So all these things. So and you have this parallel reality, like as if we are close to the peace, and this enormous tension and enormous pressure on Ukraine, so concede territories, we are close to peace deal, so do something, we are close, but we are not close to peace. We are as far from this peace as we were 1 year ago, because not a single minute Russia don't want to. And when we talk about security guarantees, like you can easily understand why Ukraine is taking that seriously. Let's maybe talk about that, about Budapest Memorandum and about what's going on today.
Yes, I absolutely agree that Russians are simply trying to buy time, and they increased their military budget. As we know, it's the biggest budget since the start of the war, and the trend is that the sanctions and the loss of over 1 million of people, of the Russian soldiers, doesn't prevent them from increasing their military budget and from going forward and forward and forward, whereas Ukraine, with the lack of American support, will be facing decreasing budgets, decreasing support of the allies, and we see also trends, very nasty trends in some of the countries of the European Union. So yeah, things are going in a very bad direction in this way. I still want to also talk about this idea that Ukraine should cede some territories. How is it possible legally? Because it's certainly a violation of any international law, and it certainly creates a precedent, a very bad precedent, that the borders, the international recognized borders, will be changed through a military offensive, and that, of course, will have a domino effect all over the world. And basically, this will be the beginning of the end of the international border system of national sovereignties, etc., etc. But even from the Ukrainian constitution, I mean, there is an article in the constitution that says that any decision about changes of territorial order in Ukraine should be done by the referendum. So the all Ukrainian referendum. So the question is, okay, will people in Crimea vote? Will people in Mariupol vote? Will people in Lysychansk vote? Because they are part of Ukraine, of internationally recognized borders. And even if they vote, Is it realistic to think that Ukrainians will say, okay, we let this go, we let these territories go? Of course not.
So if it could be a mechanism, look at the polls today, 75% of Ukrainians, as I told before, are against the idea to concede any kind of territory to Russians right now. So it could be a bad plan. And another thing, we should talk about that, because when we talk about negotiations, it could be, but all these legal things are important. And when we see, for example, Steve Witkoff or Mr. Kushner negotiate in the name of United States, we are questioning ourselves about who these people are, what kind of legal role of these people. They are special envoys of Donald Trump, but we are not talking about Rubio, so all these, as if negotiations about Ukraine are led by people who have no legal status in the United States. How binding it could be when it comes to security guarantees, for example, provided by United States in exchange of these concessions to Ukraine. So a lot of questions are here, and Trump is doing this kind of approach to Ukraine as if it's about settlement of a business deal or whatever economic deal between two countries. So one can easily understand why Ukrainians are so skeptical about this peace plan and about these negotiations, because in their reality, in our reality, there is no changes. Even worse, we have more bombardments today than 1 year ago. I've seen somewhere statistics about bombardments against civilian infrastructure, which increased, by the way, since the time this new American administration is in place. So this is, we have bigger war today than 1 year ago, and we are even more far from the peace than we were 1 year ago. So this approach to Russia, when you say, look, let's make a deal, let's share the world, let us propose you something interesting economically, and maybe you'll just settle down and you'll not continue the war. It just simply doesn't function. And this is not about Zelenskyy or about Ukrainian delegation. This is about Ukrainian people who understand, who see the voice here. And let's also compare this winter, which is extremely difficult for Ukrainian population, with previous winters we survived. So if you compare this winter with what happened in 2023, 2024, and 2024, 2025, you have much more problems today, because Russians went back to the first plan they used during the winter 2022-2023, when they bombarded deliberately electric infrastructure, heating infrastructure. So at the moment we talk, we don't have electricity, right? We have these cuts for 7-8 hours in a row, and then we have 50% of electricity, right? And we're in Kyiv, in the capital, and the situation is much worse when you approach the front lines in many places. Different, but it's in many places. So this is not the war which is happening on the front lines. This is a war which is happening, the total war, They use every way, Russians use every way to hit Ukraine, to destroy Ukraine, to make people leave, to make people, be deprived of electricity, heating, etc. So this is not about front lines. Technologically, one could say, yes, so it's more or less in a dead end. Russians progress slowly, but not really, not strategically. Ukrainians sometimes can liberate some places like Kupiansk recently, but we are still unable to progress in the other side, other direction, to liberate our territories. But this war is not about the war on the front line. This is a total war. And Ukrainians, what we do the same thing. We're trying, with deep strikes, we're trying to destroy this Russian economy, which is feeding the war, because we do know that Russian soldiers, and there's a major difference, by the way, between the Ukrainian army and Russian army. So Ukrainian army, we mobilize people, right? So everybody who has could be mobilized in the Ukrainian army, I mean men from certain age, but Russians, they sign contracts and they are paid to make the war. So basically, Russia buys soldiers, and the Ukrainian idea is to destroy the economy which has enough money to buy soldiers. That's it.
Yes, and it seems to me that all these peace negotiations is like a fog that really covers the continuation of the war by Putin. That's what we have already discussed. And Ukraine is in a kind of a deadlock because, of course, it cannot sabotage, it cannot neglect or ignore this American initiative, because in this case the blame would be put on Ukraine, as if Ukraine doesn't want peace, and therefore Russian hands will be untied. So it's a kind of Ukraine is kind of playing the game, and Zelenskyy is forced to play the game, that as if, we're approaching peace, we're approaching this, but unfortunately, maybe everybody understands that this is not the case. And Russians are playing another game. They're playing like, take this today, what we suggest to you, because in 1 year the conditions will be worse. We will suggest to you much less. We will take much more territories and some other things. And in 2 years it will be even worse and worse and worse. So that they're also playing the game with time. As we've just discussed right now, the discourse is totally shifted from the fact that we need to regain our territories. Remember that the Minsk agreements were putting Crimea beyond the brackets. Now, this peace deal is putting all the occupied territories beyond the brackets. And we are discussing the question of territories that Ukraine controls and not what Russia controls. And of course, it's very bad, because then on the next day, Russia will say, okay, Odessa is part of Russia now. We will bring Odessa into Russian constitution. We bring Kharkiv into Russian constitution. We bring Dnipro. We bring Kiev and all the rest. So now the prospects are gloomy. The prospects are not good. And if we look at Europe is also not consolidated. We see that in several countries already, France, Germany, some others, the key countries, France and Germany, far-right parties are taking the first place, and their popularity is increasing. And this is something to which Americans are, appealing to, saying this is the real Europe. We want this Europe. We want not a liberal Europe. We want a kind of patriotic Europe, the strong Europe. Well, it's all fine, but the question is that who is this strong Europe is going to fight against? It's going to fight against the unprotected migrants, but why don't you fight against the Russian threat, while all these parties seems to be the agents of Russians?
I would also add, and I think this is important, because all this pressure coming from the United States, it's coming from Trump's administration. If you look at the recent polls, in the American polls, you'll clearly see that the support of Ukraine is not decreasing in the American society, but it is increasing, on the contrary, and despite all the politics of Donald Trump and his administration. So I think, in a way, this pressure and this, rhetorics, we don't have time, you have to decide quickly, you have time until Christmas, you have time until Thanksgiving or any other date. It's also linked to the fact that Donald Trump is running out of time, because the system is that he was clearly enough, he will have midterm elections in November 2026. Some new political season will start in January 2026. And politically, he's much weaker today than he was 1 year ago. So one day, if we talked about societies, not about politicians, but about societies, I would just avoid saying that American approach. This is not American approach. This is Trump approach. Yes, Americans voted for Trump it was it was pretty close, Democrats and Republicans, but there are a lot of opposition to what Trump is doing right now inside Republican Party. So I think that a lot of this pressure is a result of his own weaknesses. If when he looks in just to the months in front of him, he understands that it's now or never, because he will never be stronger. So during this campaign, he had all his time. I also like to remind that he promised to stop this war. You remember, in 24 hours, and then in a couple of weeks, and it was a couple of months. So 1 year later, we are still where we were, and we are in a much worse position now, and we are as far from the end of this war as we were in December 2024. So it's also about his weakness. So we are playing for time. Putin is playing for time, but I think Zelenskyy, when he doesn't reject explicitly the plan, he's negotiating, but he's rejecting any kind of crazy ideas of like given territories or whatever. He's also playing for time. He knows. Everybody knows that Donald Trump is becoming weaker every month, right?
Yes, maybe, but Ukraine is becoming weaker. That's what bothers me and what worries me. Let's talk a little bit about other events of 2025, and maybe let's briefly talk about them. So, the security situation on the front line, we can say with you, because we travel a lot to the frontline areas, that of course the technological changes are enormous, and we've just visited Kherson and Izum, and with regard to both cities, we can say that the road of Izum to Slovyansk that we traveled so many times is now much more dangerous. It's covered with the nets, anti-drone nets, which means that Russian drones are going very deep into Ukrainian territory, 30-40 kilometers from the actual front line. We actually traveled to Kherson, which is on the bank of the Dnipro River, and the most dangerous big city in Ukraine. And in Kherson, there is clear human safari, to use the words of some smart people, Zarina Zabrisky and others. And look, the road to Kherson is also covered with the nets, and some streets are being covered with the nets. And this is the way how Ukrainians try to protect ourselves from these drones, right? So the situation becomes much more precarious, much more dangerous for civilians. And people who were chased by a drone say that this is a very, very bad feeling when a machine in the skies is chasing you. And the soldiers that we have met, they're saying that, look, cars that we supply to the front line are not surviving maybe not very long time, because sometimes you can have a situation when the Russian drones are just flying suspended in the skies, and they look for a car to go out of the shelter, and they just hit it immediately. So many people die being attacked by the drones, right? And this is what is happening. So if the technological advance is so big, then we can really imagine a situation when big cities in Ukraine like Dnipro, Kharkiv, or even Kyiv will be attacked by the multiple drones, and this
they
will
are already attacked by the bigger drones.
By the bigger drones, but when they are attacked, Russians are now can send 500 drones per attack, and this attack can take place once a week. But if we have 5,000 drones every day, can we imagine that? And this is probably will be a reality. And maybe the tactics of the Russians is what we have said already back in 2022, is deportation by missiles, now deportation by the drones. They want people to leave. They want people to quit Ukraine. They want people to go somewhere else, to other countries. And
I would say, yes, I would also say that when you are in a city like Kherson, what you feel immediately when you are in the city the war, this real war, was over in 2024, the moment where the city was liberated by Ukrainian army. 2022. And what is really happening since then, it's like it's pure terrorism, because as far as we know, as far as military say, there is explicitly no Russian plan to reconquer Kherson, because simply it's extremely difficult, because they have to cross Dnipro, because they have to prepare a big operation. It could be extremely difficult in these conditions. And what they basically do, they create this terror inside the city, what you say, deportation by missiles or drones, whatever, but to do what? So you just make people leave, I mean, civilians. Yeah, but it changes nothing on the battlefield, because you're still unable to conquer the city military. So, and when you talk about this, we all talk about this large, huge kill zone, which separates positions, Russian and Ukrainian positions on the front line. And if, for example, 1 year ago, this kill zone was like, I don't know, 5 kilometers away, right? So now we're talking about 30 kilometers. So it's like a place where nobody can leave, at least without risk to be killed every day. It's where the place where Russian drones and Ukrainian drones fly freely. And the battlefield, it is not on the ground, like it is in the air. So who controls this? And it creates this kind of desert where no human life, no any kind of life is possible. You know, it's like some gray zone between positions. And this is becoming larger. It's like the more we go with the time, so these drone distance, they become longer and longer, and it will create a situation in one day if we don't stop it. So it could be 100 kilometers. Can you imagine this kill zone of 100 kilometers between both armies? I mean, where people just killing everything, moving, civilians, military, whatever, because it's a huge risks to be in that area, because sooner or later you risk your life. This is about logistics, and I wonder what would happen when it's already happening today, but it could happen on another level one day when, for example, these FPV drones will be able to reach really easily and massively such cities like Kramatorsk or Slavyansk. They're already in sometimes, but if they have mass of these drones, it would be like Ukrainians will not give these territories, but it will become this place where nobody can really function, you know. I mean, civilian life would no longer be possible one day. So this is a huge challenge, how to face it, you know, how to face this technological, threat of these drones. And yes, and so that's a major change if you compare to what's happening right now in December 2025 to what we were discussing in December 2024. Drones were already there, but the distance was not the same. And I think both sides, and Ukrainians as well, we are trying to find a solution, how to fight against these tiny drones. Personally, I'm not so sure about these nets. Yes, indeed, you feel protected, at least more protected when you drive under these nets. And you can easily imagine that if there is a drone, at least, for example, one drone, if it explodes, I don't know, a couple of meters away from your car, it's maybe safer. Maybe you'll be wounded, but you'll not be killed. Or maybe your car will be damaged, but it will not be ruined. But still, this is also like it's a simple mechanical barrier, you know, like between the drone and your car, and still it's not safe at all. It's at least less dangerous, that's all.
Yeah, and we can imagine that these drones will have like cluster munitions, and there will be a lot of little bullets, let's say, or little even mines that will go away from this explosion. So it really seems a little bit a little bit strange, like how in this high technological warfare so far we protect ourselves only with these fishing nets. It's actually fishing nets, and we were traveling with our French colleagues, and they told us that many of them were brought from Brittany, from Bretagne in France, by the French fishermen who are now helping to maybe save the lives in Kherson. Let's talk a little bit about Ukrainian internal politics. So this year was marked by a huge war between the anti-corruption institutions of Ukraine and the corrupt officials, and some of the corrupt officials. And initially there was an attempt to, destroy the anti-corruption institutions. And the attempt to do it faced a huge, protests from the Ukrainian civil society, including from the Ukrainian youth. And there was kind of a very paradoxical situation when in the country of war, people go out on the streets and protest against it. And we can say that Zelenskyy is not a person who shows the authoritarian trends. It's not like a Georgian power, of course, not to say about Belarusian or Russian right now. So he immediately makes a step back, and he immediately rejected this law that cut the independence of these institutions. And then we had the development of the situation when these institutions, published the recordings of some of the Ukrainian officials, including the former energy minister and then justice minister, and things were leading to the head of the presidential office, Andriy Yermak, who is considered to be one of the most powerful persons in the Ukrainian hierarchy. And what Zelenskyy did, he fired Yermak. Mm-hmm. So it also seemed, there was lots of discussions. What does it mean in the Ukrainian situation? And people say, Ukraine is still very corrupt, hugely corrupt. Well, my response to that is that we are in the world of corruption everywhere. We are in the world where American system is hugely corrupt. We are in the world when European system is hugely corrupt because of the tax havens and because of this money laundering and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, we have less and less these checks and balances, and the system where there are so many loopholes is so vulnerable. So in this system, Ukraine does have state institutions and civil society that basically puts this onto the surface and shows this and achieves results. That's the major thing, because in many countries, like in Russia, for example, Navalny was doing lots of these investigations. Nobody cared. Even his supporters didn't really care or didn't believe that it can change anything.
Maybe they cared, but they didn't do anything about it. I mean, there were no protests on the streets, which changed the story. I think that this was a major challenge of this year, and I think despite the gloomy picture of what is happening right now, I really think that this corruption story could be potentially beneficial for Ukraine. Why? Because it was like an exam Ukraine passed once again about democracy and about the efficiency of these anti-corruption institutions. Let's remind our audience that they were created back in 2015-16, so it was also a product of after Maidan times, and there were questions how effective they could be, and now the fact that Zelenskyy, contrary to Yanukovych before, he reacts to what people think. He reacts to what polls say. He reacts to people on the streets. And when unthinkable happened, I mean, he fired Yermak. It was unthinkable 1 year ago, right? So he reacts to what the public opinion is. And I think it was a good lesson for many people. And we are not talking about Yermak, because we can imagine that a lot of people were inside these schemes. And it was also about energy sector and about protecting energy infrastructure. So that's why it was so huge issue for the Ukrainian society, because at the same time people were suffering from electricity cuts. You read in the news that some corrupt people from the ministers, they were earning money from this from this construction of the protection for energy infrastructure. This is unbelievable. So, and I think this is a chance. Let's consider this situation as a chance, not for Zelenskyy, but for Ukrainian democracy and for Ukrainian society, just to go through that and to show that so we can improve the situation, and there could be, I know, some punishment for people who do so, especially during the war. And I was shocked by the contrast of what was going on here in Ukraine with all these leaks, shameful situations, but still some consequences. And for example, these leaks of Witkov talks with Ushakov, and which proved explicitly that Witkov was talking with Russians, and he was presenting explicitly Russian agenda directly to Trump, And we all waited for response. We all waited for reaction, for a scandal. But nothing happened. Just Trump says, okay, this is not normal for guys like that who are making deals to talk like that. And this is simply, so this is normalization of this corruption and just lack of understanding of just influence, etc., etc. So nothing is so good for Ukraine right now, but at least there are some count of checks and balances, that there are some anti-corruption institutions, there are civil society, there are people who don't want these corruption schemes, there are military. I can simply imagine how their reaction to all this, so they are risking their lives. And at the same time, there are some people, constructing what they were constructing, villas in Switzerland or whatever. So it's not something you can never forget and never forgive such things, especially during the war. So it's an exam, and it's a chance for Ukraine to become better. And it's a good lesson for Zelenskyy as well.
Yeah, I agree. And let's hope that this also, because we understand that the task is not to come back to some Ukraine that it existed previously. The task is to make a very efficient, transparent country where we will have much lesser number of people. And therefore, we need to do our best to use the potential of every individual, because we can't just sacrifice other people because of corruption and put them down, or make a situation when they will leave or they will not have an opportunity to develop. We need to learn from countries that have less people, and therefore we need to learn primarily maybe from Scandinavian countries that have less people, but they have, major emphasis on the quality of education, the quality of development, etc. Yeah, thank you, Tatiana, thank you, Tanya, and thank you for this conversation. This was our reflection about the peace negotiations, the so-called peace talks, but also a little bit about the results of the 2025 for Ukraine.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, an English language media outlet about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Tatiana Harkova, a Ukrainian journalist and public intellectual, the head of the international department at Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and author of the podcast L'Ukraine face à la guerre, Ukraine Facing the War in French. UkraineWorld is an English-language media project about Ukraine run by Internet Ukraine. Let me remind you that you can support UkraineWorld on Patreon. Your contributions are essential. We rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal. You'll find all the relevant links in the episode description. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.